I took the job because I needed money, and because I told myself that 3 nights a week watching over an empty building wasn't really a big deal. The Hartwell Institute had been closed for 11 years by the time I started. It was one of those old psychiatric facilities that had operated from the 1920s through the 1990s, the kind of place that got quietly shuttered after a series of investigations and lawsuits that never quite made the national news. The county still owned the property. There was talk of converting the main building into condominiums, though every developer who toured it ended up backing out. My job was simple enough on paper. I showed up at 9 in the evening, walked the perimeter twice, checked the doors and windows on each of the 4 floors, logged anything unusual, and left at 6 in the morning. 9 hours alone in a building that hadn't held a living soul in over a decade. The first week was fine. I was 26 years old, and I'd convinced myself that fear was a product of imagination rather than instinct, and that instinct was just superstition dressed up in biology. I had a flashlight, a radio that got 2 stations, and a thermos of coffee. The building smelled like old plaster and the particular chemical sharpness of places that had once been cleaned with institutional-grade disinfectant. The floors were linoleum, cracked in places, and my footsteps made a sound that traveled ahead of me through the corridors like a warning. I walked my routes, I logged my times, I drank my coffee. I drove home in the early morning grey and slept until noon. The first thing I noticed was the smell on the 2nd floor, East Wing. It appeared during my 2nd week, sometime around midnight on a Tuesday. I've tried many times since then to describe it accurately. It wasn't decay, not exactly, though decay was in the family of that smell. It was something older and sweeter and wrong in a way I couldn't name. I checked for animals. I looked for water damage that might have encouraged mold. I found nothing. The smell wasn't constant. It came and went, strongest near room 214, which had been a patient room, according to the building's original floor plan that the property management company had given me for reference. I noted it in my log as possible moisture intrusion and moved on. The second thing I noticed was the doors. Interior doors at the Hartwell Institute had been propped open when the facility closed. This was standard practice. It prevented moisture accumulation and allowed for air circulation, according to the property manager, a distracted man named Gerald, who called me every Monday to ask if anything had been vandalized. The doors were heavy, solid wood with frosted glass panels in the upper third. On my first night, they were all open, held with rubber wedges that had been there so long they'd partially fused to the floor. By the end of my 3rd week, one of the doors in the East Wing was closed. I checked it carefully. The rubber wedge was sitting 6 inches away from the door, as if it had been deliberately removed and set aside. I put the wedge back. I noted it in the log as possible settling. Gerald called Monday and said buildings do that sometimes, and not to worry. The following Tuesday, 3 doors were closed. The wedges were arranged in a neat line against the baseboard opposite each door, evenly spaced, as if someone had taken some care in their placement. I want to be clear about something. I am not a person who jumps to extraordinary explanations. I called Gerald on Wednesday instead of waiting for Monday. I told him what I'd found. He said he'd look into whether any inspectors or contractors had been in the building. He called back Thursday and said no one had been authorized to enter the building since the previous month, when a structural engineer had done a routine evaluation of the East Wing foundation. I asked him whether the structural engineer had been in on a Tuesday night. Gerald said that was an odd question. I said I knew it was an odd question, but could he check? He called back Friday morning just as I was leaving my shift and said the structural engineer had done his assessment on a Wednesday afternoon in daylight. I kept the job. I needed the money, and I still believed in the rational explanation waiting just around the corner if I looked hard enough. The recording started in my 5th week. The facility had an old intercom system, the kind with a master panel in the security station near the main entrance and speaker units mounted near the ceiling in each corridor and common room. The system had been disconnected when the building closed. Gerald confirmed this, and the panel itself showed no power, no lights, nothing. On a Thursday night, at approximately 2:40 in the morning, I was sitting at the security station drinking my third cup of coffee when one of the speakers made a sound. Not static, not the hiss of a system warming up, a sound like someone inhaling slowly and then stopping before the exhale. I sat very still for a long time. It didn't happen again that night. The following Thursday, same time, same thing. But this time there were two sounds. The inhale, the stop, and then something that might have been a word spoken too quietly and too quickly to understand. I went to the panel and looked at it for a long time. Every indicator was dark. The power cable had been cut cleanly at the junction box behind the panel, and the cut was old, the copper oxidized and dull. I started bringing a recorder, a small digital voice recorder I'd used in college for lectures. I set it on the security station panel and let it run. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then on a Wednesday, not a Thursday, which somehow disturbed me more than if it had maintained its schedule, I came back from my 2 a.m. perimeter walk and played back the recording from while I'd been away. There was a voice. It was not speaking to me. That was my first impression, and I held to it because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to consider. The voice was speaking in the measured, repetitive way of someone working through a thought or reciting something from memory. I could make out fragments, a name possibly, something with a hard consonant in the middle, something like Marlene or Carlene, but not quite either. A number repeated several times. Room numbers, maybe. And once, very clearly, a phrase that I heard without any ambiguity at all, despite the poor recording quality. She knows where it is. I called Gerald and quit the following morning. That should have been the end of it. I moved across the city. I got a day job at a shipping warehouse. I did not think about the Hartwell Institute every day. Some days, I didn't think about it at all. I dated someone for a while, a woman named Sarah who thought I was funny and liked the same bad movies I did. And for several months, I was what I would describe as genuinely okay. The envelope arrived 14 months after I'd quit. It was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize, at my current address. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, slightly degraded in the way of photographs that have been reproduced from copies of copies. It showed a hospital corridor. I recognized it immediately. The particular width of the hallway, the pattern of the ceiling tiles, the placement of the speaker units near the ceiling. It was the east wing, second floor, somewhere near room 214. The corridor in the photograph was not empty. There was a figure standing at the far end, blurred with distance and whatever quality of the original image, facing the camera, standing very still. There was nothing else in the envelope, no note, no return address. The postmark was local. I told myself it was a prank. Someone who knew I'd worked there, who'd found an old photograph of the building and decided to unsettle me. This is still the explanation I return to when I'm trying to sleep. It's the rational explanation. Buildings settle. Animals move things. Old intercom systems can develop faults that aren't immediately visible. Photographs can be sent by strangers with poor judgment and no understanding of the impact they're having. I went back 3 weeks ago. I don't know why. I've tried to articulate it to myself and I can't. I drove to the Hartwell Institute at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The exterior was unchanged. The county had put new chains on the gates, but the fence was in the same condition, and I knew from my nights working there that the southeast corner had a section that could be pushed back enough to squeeze through if you were willing to tear your jacket slightly. I was. The building was unlocked, not broken into. The lock on the staff entrance door in the rear had been opened with a key and not secured again, just pulled to. Someone with a key had been there recently, or was there still? I should have left. I had a flashlight. I went in. I did not call out. The silence of the building was the same silence I remembered, that particular quality of quiet that feels occupied rather than empty, like a room where someone has just finished speaking, and the air is still holding the shape of their words. I walked to the security station. The digital recorder I'd left behind when I quit was still on the panel. I had assumed someone had collected it or thrown it away. It was sitting exactly where I'd left it, or placed back where I'd left it, facing the corridor in the same direction it had faced when I set it there months before. The battery light was green. The battery should have been long dead. I did not touch the recorder. I went upstairs to the second floor, east wing. I don't know what I expected to find. The room 214 door was closed. The others in the corridor were open, the rubber wedges still in place against the baseboards in their neat line. I stood in front of room 214 for a long time. The smell I'd noted in my log, old and sweet and wrong, was very strong here. Stronger than I'd ever experienced it during my time working there. The door to room 214 has a frosted glass panel in the upper third. The glass is old, slightly wavery in the way glass gets when it's original to a building from that era, when manufacturing wasn't quite precise enough to eliminate all distortion. There was a light on the other side of the door, not the beam of a flashlight, not the flickering of a phone screen. A steady, ambient light, dim and with a quality I can't describe except to say it was the wrong color for anything I could explain. I stood in front of that door for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been several minutes, and then I heard it. A sound from the room. Not the intercom, not the voice I'd heard on my recordings. A sound like the one I'd heard the first time through the speaker, late at a Thursday night. The one I'd described as someone inhaling and stopping before the exhale. Only it was not coming from the speaker this time. It was coming from directly in front of me, from just on the other side of the door. I backed away from room 214. I went down the corridor and down the stairs and through the staff entrance and through the gap in the fence and across the parking lot. And I drove away, and I did not stop moving until I was back on the highway with the lights of other cars around me. I still have the photograph. I've looked at it many times now, trying to make sense of the figure at the end of the corridor. The blur of distance makes it difficult to be certain about details. I've told myself it's a trick of the image quality, a flaw in the reproduction, a coincidence of shadow and degraded film. But the figure at the end of that corridor is facing the camera, and it is very slightly closer than it appears to have been the last time I looked. I don't go back to look at the photograph every day. I've hidden it in a drawer in my kitchen, under some takeout menus, and a cable I don't recognize the purpose of anymore. Some mornings I wake up, and I don't think about it at all. Some mornings I make coffee, and I stand in my kitchen, and I find myself listening, without meaning to, for the sound of something on the other side of a door that I haven't yet learned to leave closed. I'm writing this down because I think it matters that someone knows. I'm writing this down because the envelope was addressed to my current apartment, and I don't know how anyone who'd been inside the Hartwell Institute could have known where I live now. I'm writing this down because this morning when I went to make coffee, I found the kitchen drawer already open. The photograph was still there. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except the figure in the photograph was no longer at the end of the corridor. I've looked at every part of that image. I've held it under a lamp and examined every inch of that hallway. Whatever was standing at the far end is no longer there, and I have not yet worked out where it has gone.